The shack stood on a rise above the Bitterroot Valley, its roof sagging and its timbers blackened by wind and years of sun. Folks in town whispered that no man with sense would take it, not with the stories that clung to it like burrs to a mule's tail. They said a family once called it home, but they were gone now, gone so completely that not even bones were left to prove they had ever lived. The land agents had given up trying to sell it. It stood waiting, the subject of quiet talk around card tables and bar counters. But Elias McGraw wasn't a man to be swayed by whispers. He had spent 20 years in the mountains, running trap lines through snow so deep a man could lose his soul in it. He had faced grizzlies in the dark and storms that split trees like kindling. Superstition had no weight with him. What he wanted now was a roof, 4 walls, and a piece of ground to call his own. He paid near nothing for the shack, just a signature and a nod from the county clerk, who warned, "You'll regret it, McGraw. That place ain't fit for living." Elias had only tipped his hat, thanked the man, and turned his mule back toward the road. Before we follow his journey deeper into the valley, I'll ask you, if you enjoy tales of the old frontier, of men tested against the land and their own past, don't forget to subscribe. There are more stories to come, each one a window into lives carved from raw wilderness. Elias had the look of a man carved from the very hills, broad-shouldered, weather-beaten, his hair grey though he was not yet old. His eyes, however, held a restless hunger. For years he had wandered from one trapping ground to the next, trading pelts for whiskey and ammunition, then slipping back into solitude. The mountains had shaped him into a figure most men avoided, but now he longed for something different. Roots, perhaps, a fire that burned not only to keep out the cold, but to warm a home. The shack was no home yet. When Elias first stood before it, the place reeked of rot and abandonment. Weeds pushed through the steps. A shutter hung loose, banging against the siding when the wind picked up. Inside, dust lay thick on the floorboards, and in one corner a small chair sat toppled on its side, as though a child had run out in haste and never returned. He set his gear down and breathed in the air, pine, earth, and the faint tang of old smoke that clung to the stones of the hearth. Despite the ruin, a spark of stubbornness lit in him. He had slept in caves colder than death and lean-tos that barely kept off rain. This, broken though it was, could be made whole again. The nearest settlement lay 15 miles east, a scattering of saloons, a general store, and a sheriff's office standing watch over the restless comings and goings of ranch hands, drifters and prospectors. Elias had passed through only once before. Now with the shack his own, that settlement would become his lifeline for flour, nails, and company, should he ever want it. Yet he knew the stares he'd receive when he came into town. Men mistrusted those who kept too much to themselves, and women whispered warnings to their children not to linger near. His reputation as a mountain man followed him like a shadow, half legend, half unease. Still, Elias carried himself with a quiet steadiness, neither asking for welcome nor fearing rejection. As he looked at the shack, Elias muttered to himself, "Reckon you'll do." His voice sounded strange in the stillness, as though the hills themselves had been holding their breath. He set about unpacking his mule, staking a claim not just on the land but on a future he meant to build, one board at a time. The past of the shack was a mystery, but Elias believed the future of it lay in his calloused hands. Still, the silence of the place weighed heavy, as though the walls remembered and the earth beneath them held secrets he had yet to uncover. And thus began his first steps into a story, where the land, the people, and the truth of what once happened here would test him in ways no mountain storm ever had. Elias McGraw had not always dreamed of land and walls. In truth, there was a time when the very thought of staying in one place made his chest tighten, as though the earth itself might swallow him if he stayed too long. He was born to a poor Tennessee farmer, one of 8 children, and by the age of 16 he had seen more loss than comfort. His mother was taken by fever, 2 brothers swept away in the flood of '48, and his father carried bitterness heavier than any plowshare. Home had never been a word filled with warmth, so Elias fled. He turned his back on the plowed furrows and hungry mouths, setting his boots toward the high country, where a man's survival rested on skill, grit, and luck. The mountains became both enemy and companion. Winter mornings, his beard froze stiff with ice before the sun touched the ridges. Summer nights he lay awake listening to the crack of branches under prowling wolves. He trapped, skinned, and sold furs for flour and powder, and when loneliness pressed too hard, he rode into a town, traded his earnings for whiskey, and disappeared again before anyone could ask his name. Yet those years, long and unforgiving, carved something into him. He learned to read the sky as one reads a map, to find water where there was none, and to measure men with a single glance. They called him the Mountain Ghost, a figure who appeared at trading posts with hides slung across his mule, only to vanish for another season. He wore that reputation like a cloak, proud and apart. But solitude has a way of wearing a man thin. As Elias neared 50, the mountains no longer filled him with the same wild hunger. He began to feel the emptiness of fireless nights. A man could survive storms and grizzlies, but silence was a foe more cunning than any beast. His bones ached for steadiness, for a hearth that did not vanish with the melting of snow. It was Sarah Jennings, the widowed innkeeper in the small town east of the Bitterroot, who first gave voice to what Elias had buried deep. One evening when he stopped for a hot meal, she studied him with her sharp grey eyes. "You look tired of drifting, McGraw," she said softly, sliding a plate of stew before him. "A man can't live rootless forever. Even coyotes make dens." Elias grunted, though her words settled in him like embers. "A den ain't much of a home." "Maybe not," she answered, "but it's a start. You keep running and you'll end with nothing but tracks in the snow. Ain't no one remembers tracks once the thaw comes." That night he lay awake in the inn's narrow bed, the words circling like hawks. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps it was time to stop leaving nothing but fading trails. Still, the decision was not simple. When word spread that Elias had bought the abandoned shack, the townfolk shook their heads. Men muttered that he was a fool, women whispered of curses, and children dared one another to ride past the place at night. Supplies were scarce too. Timber cost dear, nails even more, and Elias had only what he could scrape from years of trading hides. He'd need to stretch every coin, every bit of muscle, to make the shack stand. Sheriff Walt Hensley, a broad man with a bristling mustache, met him outside the general store. "McGraw," he said, tugging his hat low, "I ain't one to meddle, but you ought to know folks don't take kindly to strangers planting themselves on land with shadows over it. If you aim to stay, you'd best prove you belong." Elias met his gaze steady. "Belonging don't come from permission, Sheriff. It comes from work, and I aim to work." Hensley gave a slow nod, though doubt clouded his eyes. The shack waited on the rise, half collapsed and ridiculed, yet Elias felt a strange determination settle in his chest. For the first time in decades, his wandering had purpose. The land was rough, the people suspicious, the odds steep, but all his life had been preparation for this moment. He meant to turn ruin into shelter, silence into belonging. Still, in the quiet corners of his mind, he wondered, would his strength be enough against both wilderness and whispers? The first dawn Elias woke in the shack, frost filmed the inside of the window. His breath smoked in the air, and the rafters creaked as though the place resented being stirred from its long slumber. He rolled from his bedroll, joints stiff from cold, and took in the bare room. Dust motes floated where the sunlight pierced cracks in the boards, and every shadow seemed to whisper that he was not welcome. Still, he had known worse. He struck a fire in the stone hearth, coaxing flame from scraps of pine he'd gathered the night before. The warmth was meager but enough to thaw his hands. As the fire grew, he walked the room, noting each repair that would demand his strength. The roof sagged at the middle, the floorboards bowed, and the shutters clattered with every gust of wind. It would take months of labor, but Elias felt a stubborn satisfaction. Here was a battle he could see with his eyes and meet with his hands. By midday he was hauling logs from the tree line, his mule braying at the weight of each drag. He set to work trimming and stacking them, his axe ringing sharp against the silence of the hills. Sweat beaded on his brow despite the chill. He drove nails salvaged from fallen planks, cursing softly each time one bent. The land gave no applause, only the low whistle of the wind across the valley. Yet each blow of his hammer echoed with resolve. This ruin would be his home. But the shack was not without reminders of its past. While clearing a corner, Elias uncovered a wooden toy horse, its paint chipped and faded. He turned it over in his calloused hand, a strange tightness gathering in his chest. A child had once clutched this, racing it across the very floor where he now stood. He placed it gently on the mantel above the hearth, unsure why he kept it, but unwilling to cast it aside. Later, rummaging through a pile of broken furniture, he found a pair of small shoes tucked under a collapsed bench. They were worn thin at the soles, the leather cracked from age. Elias straightened slowly, unease prickling the back of his neck. These were not things left by chance. They were the kind of belongings carried by families, cherished and necessary. To find them abandoned gave the air a weight he could not shake. That night, as he lay by the fire, the sounds of the shack pressed heavy against him. The timbers groaned as if shifting under old burdens. The wind slipped through cracks, carrying with it a hollow whistle that might have been mistaken for a sigh. Elias pulled his blanket tighter and muttered, "Wind's just wind, nothing more." Still, his hand strayed toward the rifle at his side before he drifted to uneasy sleep. The following days passed in toil. He patched the roof with bark and timber, reinforced the door, and dug a shallow trench to carry runoff from the spring rains. Each task left him bone-tired, yet each night he slept with a little more certainty. The shack was bending, however grudgingly, to his will, and yet even in daylight strange impressions lingered. He would return from cutting wood to find the shutters swinging, though no storm had passed. Once he discovered animal tracks circling the shack, though none led away. Coyote, perhaps, but the prints seemed too small, too scattered, like the steps of something hesitant. Elias forced himself not to dwell on it. "A man don't last if he starts hearing ghosts in every rafter," he muttered. Still, the toy horse remained on the mantel, a silent reminder of what once was. He found his eyes returning to it more often than he cared to admit. The land tested him with silence and with secrets, and though Elias pressed forward, part of him could not ignore the question that crept unbidden into his mind. What had truly happened to the family who left so much behind? The first time Elias rode into town after settling in, he felt the shift in the air before a single word was spoken. The general store quieted as he pushed the door open, the bell jangling above him. Men at the counter lowered their voices, and two women by the dry goods barrels turned their backs quickly, whispering. Elias kept his head low, tipping his hat, and went about gathering flour, coffee, and salt. He had lived long enough to know when talk was aimed at him. At the counter, old Mr. Farnsworth weighed out his flour with a stiff hand. "Can't say I envy you, McGraw," he muttered without looking up. "That shack ain't brought luck to anyone who touched it." Elias set his coins down. "Luck's never had much business with me, Farnsworth. Hard work's all I count on." The storekeeper's eyes flicked to him at last, narrow and skeptical. "Work don't change what's buried in the ground." Elias didn't ask what he meant. He gathered his parcels, feeling the stairs follow him out. By evening, word had traveled faster than any horse. At the saloon where whiskey loosened tongues, Elias's name and the shack were tangled in every conversation. Men spoke of the family who had once lived there, a farmer named Thomas Avery, his wife Margaret, and their two children. Some claimed the Averys had been driven mad by isolation. Others swore they had vanished in the dead of night, leaving food still on the table. The tale shifted with each telling, but one detail remained constant. They had disappeared without trace. Sarah Jennings told him more plainly a few days later, when he stopped at her inn for supper. She set a bowl of stew before him, then leaned across the table with a weary look. "You should know, Elias, folks won't let that place rest easy. The Averys were good people. Thomas brought seed from Missouri, talked of building a future out there. Then one winter they were gone, house left as though they'd stepped outside and never stepped back in. No bodies, no wagon tracks, just gone." Elias stirred his stew, appetite dulled. "And you believe all that?" Sarah sighed. "I believe they're gone, and that no one's been able to make a life there since. Families tried. Men, too, always left after a season or two. They said it never felt right." He chewed slowly, her words settling heavy. Yet stubbornness, the old mountain-forged kind, bristled in him. "I've faced storms worse than whispers, Sarah. That shack's wood and stone. Whatever happened to the Averys don't change what I can build." She studied him for a long moment, then said softly, "Maybe. But you do well to remember, sometimes it's not just storms a man's up against. Sometimes it's what lingers in folks' hearts." The next morning, Elias felt the truth of that. As he passed through town with supplies loaded on his mule, children pointed and hushed. A ranch hand spat in the dirt as Elias walked by. Another muttered, "Dead place for a dead man." Elias's jaw tightened, but he didn't break stride. He had lived under suspicion before, marked as an outsider by choice. Yet this was different. These people didn't just mistrust him. They feared the land he had chosen, as if it carried a sickness. Back at the shack, unloading his goods, Elias caught himself glancing at the toy horse on the mantel. For the first time, doubt whispered louder than the wind. He sat by the fire that night, staring at the flames, his mind circling the same question. Was he carving a home, or stepping into a grave someone else had already dug? Still, as the fire snapped and the valley darkened around him, Elias set his jaw. He had claimed the shack, and he meant to stand by it. Whatever truth lay behind the rumors, he would face it in his own way, with his own hands. Autumn in the Bitterroot came swift and sharp. The winds carried the bite of snow long before the first flakes fell, and Elias knew he was racing the season. Each morning he rose before dawn, gathering wood, mending the roof and setting traps to keep meat on the table. The shack groaned against the cold, as though it too braced for the coming winter. But no amount of work could soften the land's indifference. Wolves prowled near the edge of his clearing, their howls rolling across the hills at night. One morning he found a lamb dead, throat torn open, though he owned no flock himself. A neighbor's sheep must have wandered close, and the tracks showed the wolves had passed less than 100 yards from his door. The knowledge settled in him like ice. The storms were worse. Rain turned the soil to muck, and when the temperature dropped, the ground froze solid. Elias split logs until his shoulders ached, stacking them high, knowing it would never feel like enough. "You'll run me ragged before the first snow," he muttered to the valley, swinging his axe with renewed fury. Yet the hardest trials were not the wolves or the weather. They were the long hours of silence. Elias had lived alone before, but in the mountains there had always been motion, rivers rushing, trees shifting, animals moving unseen. Here the silence was heavier, pressed against the walls of the shack like a weight. Nights stretched slow, each crack of timber sounding louder than it should, each gust of wind rattling his resolve. One evening, after a day spent repairing the fence line, Elias sat by the fire with a tin cup of coffee. The toy horse still rested on the mantel, its chipped paint flickering in the firelight. He stared at it longer than he meant to, feeling something unfamiliar. A tug, almost like companionship, though it unsettled him. He shook his head, muttering, "Fool's thoughts," before draining his cup. Despite his strength, doubt crept in. His provisions ran thin faster than expected, and each trip to town reminded him he was not welcome. A merchant sold him flour with reluctance, charging a few cents more than was fair. Ranch hands turned away when he greeted them, or else stared with that same look, pity mixed with suspicion. Elias carried their judgment back to the shack each time, the weight of it heavier than any lumber he hauled. One particularly cold night, a storm rolled in with a fury that shook the shack. Wind screamed through the chinks, lifting the roof as though it meant to tear it free. Elias pressed his back against the door to keep it from flying open, every muscle straining. For hours he battled the storm with nothing but his body and grit. When dawn broke, the shack still stood, though battered, and Elias slumped against the doorframe, drained but defiant. In the aftermath, exhaustion gave way to a kind of grim pride. He had survived worse in the high country, yet the whispers of the townsfolk returned to him unbidden. Maybe the land don't want you here, he thought. He pushed the notion away, but it clung like burrs to his mind. One afternoon, while gathering water from the creek, he caught sight of his reflection, gaunt cheeks, beard thick with grey, eyes lined by years of hardship. He studied himself with a cold honesty. "You look like a man fighting shadows," he said aloud. The creek rippled his reflection, breaking it apart. Still, even as the hardships mounted, Elias refused to bend. Each board he nailed, each log he split, each night he survived the cold felt like a victory. The land might test him with hunger, loneliness, and fear, but he had not come to surrender. He had come to carve a place for himself. What he did not yet know was that the true trials would not only come from the wilderness, but from the shadows of men who walked upon it. Elias first noticed them at dusk. He was stacking the last of the firewood when the mule snorted and pawed the ground, ears pinned toward the ridge. Elias followed its gaze and saw two riders silhouetted against the fading light. They didn't move closer, only sat their horses on the high ground, watching. After a moment they wheeled away without a word. He stood still, axe in hand, the weight of their presence lingering even after they vanished. Strangers passing through wasn't unusual in the territory, but something in their stillness unsettled him. They had watched too long, like men measuring rather than merely passing. That night Elias kept his rifle across his knees as he sat by the fire. The crackle of the flames seemed louder than usual, and the shadows at the corners of the shack felt deeper. He told himself not to borrow trouble, but instinct whispered otherwise. He had lived long in the mountains by trusting such whispers. The following day, he rode into town for supplies. The general store was busy with ranch hands, dust on their boots and sweat on their collars. Sheriff Walt Hensley stood near the counter, arms folded, listening as a group of men spoke in low tones. The talk hushed as Elias entered, but Walt gave him a steady nod. After Elias finished his purchases, the sheriff stepped outside with him. "McGraw," he said, voice low, "you been seeing strangers out by your place?" Elias narrowed his eyes. "2 riders last night." Watched a spell, then moved on. Walt's jaw tightened. "That tracks with what I've heard. Couple fellas drifted into the valley, asking after the old Avery place. Didn't give names, but they don't smell like cowhands to me." "Bandits?" Elias asked. Could be worse." The sheriff's gaze was steady. "I'll tell you plain, McGraw, those hills still hold trouble. Men who figure the law don't reach as far as the wind blows. You keep that rifle near. Ain't no shame in being ready." Elias gave a slow nod. "I didn't buy that shack to be run off easy." "Good," Walt said, adjusting his hat. "But don't mistake pride for safety. Pride gets men buried." Elias rode back with the sheriff's words chewing at him. The shack came into view as the sun dipped low, and for the first time he studied it not just as a home, but as a place that might need defending. Its walls were thin, the door patched, the windows rattling in their frames. Against weather, it stood fair enough. Against men, it was little more than kindling. That evening he walked the perimeter, studying the rise of the land and the cover of trees. He marked where a rifle would have clear sight, where shadows might hide a man. His heart was steady but heavy, the old instincts stirring like coals roused from ash. He had left behind the life of constant vigilance, or so he thought. Yet here it was again, uninvited. Later, as he sat by the fire, the toy horse on the mantel caught his eye. Its chipped paint glowed faintly in the flicker. He wondered if Thomas Avery had once sat in this same spot, hearing riders approach, feeling that same watchful dread. Elias muttered, "If they came for you, old friend, I'll not let 'em come for me easy." Sleep was shallow that night. Every crack of timber, every whisper of wind set him alert. He rose twice to check the clearing, rifle in hand, though nothing stirred but the restless mule. By dawn his resolve hardened. Strangers or no, wolves or storms, he would not yield. The shack was his now, and whatever shadows circled it, they would find him standing firm. Still, as he stepped outside and saw fresh tracks leading from the ridge, the weight of the truth settled over him. The land's trials were no longer just of weather and wilderness. Men had taken interest, and men could be far more dangerous. Weeks passed, and Elias understood that survival meant more than a rifle and a strong back. The shack gave him shelter, but the valley's challenges could not be faced alone forever. He needed tools, supplies, and, though he loathed to admit it, some measure of human connection. So with Pelt strapped to his mule, he made his way to town more often, learning to shoulder the stairs with quiet patience. The first small shift came at Sarah Jennings's inn. He entered late one evening, cold air clinging to his coat, and found the tables crowded with ranch hands. Their laughter dimmed when he walked in, but Sarah greeted him openly. "Coffee's hot, stew's fresh," she called, wiping her hands on her apron. "Sit yourself down, Elias." He did, grateful for her kindness. As she set a steaming bowl before him, one of the ranchers muttered loud enough to be heard, "Man lives in the Avery place, Sarah. Best not serve him too much or he'll bring that curse inside with him." Sarah's eyes snapped to the man. "Curse don't cook stew, Hank." "Work does, and far as I can tell, McGraw's been working harder than most." The room quieted. Elias lifted his spoon, saying nothing, but the warmth he felt came not from the stew alone. It was the first time someone had stood up for him in this town. A few days later, Elias brought smoked venison to trade at the general store. Mr. Farnsworth accepted it reluctantly, but a younger man in line, a ranch hand named Caleb, stepped forward. "You do that yourself, McGraw?" Caleb asked, eyeing the cuts. Elias nodded. "Hunted it by the ridge. Smoked it 3 days." Caleb whistled low. "That's good work." "My pa always said a man who knows how to cure meat'll never starve." The words were simple, but they cracked the wall of suspicion just a little. Elias answered with the faintest hint of a smile. "Reckon your pa was right." That evening, Elias walked the street and heard fewer whispers. The town was not welcoming him outright, but curiosity was beginning to replace fear. Sheriff Hensley noticed, too. He stopped Elias outside the blacksmith's one morning. "You keep showing folks you're more than a shadow, McGraw, and they might just start seeing you as a man. Don't expect it quick. Out here, trust is earned slower than spring." "I ain't asking for their trust," Elias replied. "Only fair trade." "Maybe so," the sheriff said, adjusting his hat. "But fair trade can lead to fair respect. Don't underestimate that." Bit by bit, Elias allowed himself to settle into these new bonds. He shared traps with a rancher who offered to exchange nails, gave advice on weather signs to a boy eager to learn, and even joined a card game one slow evening at Sarah's inn. He lost more than he won, but the men at the table no longer went silent when he sat down. Still, mistrust lingered in some corners. More than once he caught hard stares, and whispers of the Avery family's fate clung to him like smoke. But now he also caught nods, greetings offered with cautious respect, and that was more than he had dared hope. On one trip back to the shack, Elias paused at the ridge and looked down at the valley. The town crouched at its edge. For the first time in years, he felt the faint stirrings of belonging. Not acceptance, not yet, but the possibility of it. He muttered to himself, "Takes more than swinging an axe to make a home, takes people too." Damned strange thought. The mule flicked its ears as if in agreement. Elias chuckled low, surprising himself with the sound. He urged the animal onward, carrying not just supplies, but the weight of a small, growing hope. The shack still bore its scars, the land still tested him, and the shadows had not faded. But Elias was no longer fighting them alone. The town was beginning, however reluctantly, to play its part in his story. The work of rebuilding the shack carried Elias into late autumn. Each day he cut timber, patched leaks, and stored food against the winter. Yet even as the walls grew sturdier, a sense of unease lingered. It was not only the memory of strangers on the ridge or the whispers of townsfolk. It was something inside the shack itself, something that felt half-hidden. One afternoon, while clearing brush near the back, Elias stumbled on a sunken patch of earth. His boot sank deep, and when he knelt to dig, his hand struck wood. He uncovered the rotting edge of a trapdoor, nearly consumed by weeds. The hinges groaned as he pried it open, revealing a dark hollow beneath. The air that rose from it was stale, carrying the scent of mold and old dust. Elias lowered himself carefully, lantern in hand, and found a cramped cellar. The walls were lined with shelves, most of them collapsed, their jars shattered. Against the far wall, broken furniture lay scattered, as if tossed in haste. Scratches scored the wood, long gouges that did not look like the work of animals. Elias set the lantern higher, heart pounding in his chest. He was not a man given to fear, but the place pressed on him with a weight that made his skin prickle. In one corner lay a child's wooden spoon still intact, and beside it a doll's head, its porcelain cracked. He lifted it gently, studying the faded paint of its eyes. Back above ground, he sat on the steps, staring at the object in his hands. His mind circled the same question again and again. Why had a family left so much behind? A man could lose cattle, land, even pride, but children's belongings were the last thing any parent abandoned. That evening, when Elias rode to town for nails, he carried the doll wrapped in cloth. At Sarah Jennings's inn, he laid it on the counter where she served him stew. Her face paled. "That was theirs," she whispered. "Margaret Avery kept that doll for her daughter Anna. Folks said the girl carried it everywhere." Elias leaned closer. "Then why was it buried in a cellar?" "The place looks like someone left in a hurry. You know more than whispers, Sarah. Tell me plain." She met his eyes, torn between reluctance and sympathy. "All I know is the Averys planned a harvest supper the week they vanished. Thomas traded for flour and sugar, told everyone he meant to invite the neighbors, then nothing. No supper, no goodbyes. When men rode out to check, the door was open, food on the stove, and the family gone. Sheriff back then searched, but they never found tracks leading away. It was as if the earth swallowed them whole." Elias sat in silence, spoon idle in his stew. Finally he said, "Earth don't swallow people, Sarah. Men do." She looked at him with unease. "Be careful, Elias. Dig too deep into the past, and you might find more than you bargained for." When he returned to the shack, Elias stored the doll beside the toy horse on the mantel. The two relics stared back at him in the firelight, haunting in their simplicity. He tried to focus on his tasks, repairing the chimney, splitting wood, but the images clung to him. Broken furniture, scratched wood. Objects left behind as though the family had been chased, not merely vanished. That night the wind rattled the shutters, and Elias lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He muttered to himself, "If there's truth buried here, I'll find it. Shack's mine now, and I'll not live in the shadow of ghosts." But deep down, he knew the past was clawing its way forward, and sooner or later it would demand to be reckoned with. Winter swept into the valley with a force that silenced all other worries. Snow fell heavy and fast, burying the shack to its windowsills and sealing the trails Elias once used for hunting and supply. The sky hung low for days at a time, grey and pressing, and the air was sharp enough to split a man's lungs. Inside, Elias rationed his stores carefully: dried venison, beans, flour, coffee. He counted each meal, knowing the nearest town might as well have been 100 miles away. The shack, though strengthened by his repairs, creaked under the weight of the snow. Every gust of wind shook the shutters, as if unseen hands tried to pry them open. For the first week, Elias busied himself with chores. He mended traps, sharpened knives, and wrote short notes in a battered journal he had carried for years. The words were spare, more habit than confession. Day 14. Storm strong, mule restless, woodpile shrinking. Yet the act steadied him, giving shape to days that otherwise bled together in silence. By the second week, loneliness pressed harder. The fire's crackle became his only companion, and shadows lengthened in strange ways across the walls. At night, he thought he heard faint noises, the scrape of wood, the patter of light steps above him, though no one was there. Once he woke to the sound of his mule braying wildly, only to find nothing outside but snowdrifts. Sitting by the fire one night, he muttered, "Storm's playing tricks on your ears, old man. Nothing more." His own voice startled him with how hollow it sounded. He tried to read the land even from indoors. The howl of wolves echoed faintly, carried across the frozen hills. The storm's rhythm told him when the weather might break, yet all the knowledge he had gained from years in the mountains could not ease the ache of human absence. He longed, though he would never say it aloud, for a voice other than his own. To ease the silence, Elias began talking to the relics on the mantel. The toy horse, the porcelain doll, strange companions, but the only ones he had. "You two been here longer than me," he said one evening, staring at them through the firelight. "Reckon you know this place's secrets better'n I do. Ain't you gonna tell me?" He chuckled low, though the sound carried no mirth. Another day, as snow battered the windows, he read back through his journal. He found old entries from years past, written in the wilderness, notes of hunts, storms, near escapes. He saw the man he had been, solitary, strong, unbending, and wondered if that man was slipping away. The Elias of now was tired, worn by silence, pressed by the weight of a mystery he could not shake. The worst night came when the blizzard roared so fierce it shook the shack as if trying to rip it from the ground. Snow forced its way through cracks, stinging his skin with icy breath. Elias heaped wood into the fire until it blazed hot, but still the cold gnawed at him. He wrapped himself in blankets, teeth clenched, whispering, "You'll not take me, not tonight." When dawn broke, weak and pale, the storm had passed. Elias stepped outside, boots sinking deep, and stared at the world smothered in white. Silence blanketed everything, but not the comforting kind. This silence was absolute, as if the valley itself had been erased. He turned back to the shack, his only anchor in the emptiness, and felt both pride and dread. Pride because it still stood. Dread because so did he, alone. Inside, he wrote one line in his journal. Storm broke. Still here. Then he closed it and sat long by the fire, staring into the embers. The thought crept in, unwelcome but persistent. How long could a man hold out before the silence claimed more than his voice? When the thaw finally came, the valley softened under patches of green, but Elias's spirit did not ease. He had weathered the storms, yet something darker pressed close now. The sense of being watched had returned, sharper than before. It was early evening when he spotted them again. Two riders, the same pair from months earlier, lingered at the tree line. They did not approach, did not call out, just watched. Elias stood in the doorway with his rifle resting casual but ready across his arms. At length, the riders turned and slipped back into the woods. The silence they left behind was heavier than their presence. That night, Elias kept the fire low, listening. Around midnight, faint hoofbeats reached his ears. He rose, rifle in hand, and moved to the window. Shadows shifted at the edge of the clearing. A voice carried low, rough with menace. "Man's stubborn. Maybe needs convincing." A second voice answered, colder. "Convincing or burying? Makes no matter." The words iced Elias's blood. He eased the window shut and crouched low. Minutes dragged like hours, until the sound of retreating hooves faded into the hills. The next day he rode into town, jaw set, and went straight to Sheriff Hensley. The lawman listened without interruption, arms folded across his chest. When Elias finished, Walt grunted. "Sounds like them drifters I warned you of. Bandit breed." They've had their eyes on that land before. Never thought they'd linger this long. Elias narrowed his eyes. "Why the Avery place? What is it to them?" Walt scratched his jaw. "Can't say for certain. Might be they wanted it, and Thomas Avery stood in their way. Folks don't talk much about it now, but there were whispers of threats before the Averys vanished. If these men are the same cut, they're circling back to finish what they started." Elias's grip tightened on his hat brim. "I won't scare easy, but I'd know if I'm defending against wolves or men." "Both, most likely," Walt said grimly. "Keep that rifle close. And Elias, don't mistake grit for invincibility. You've got allies here. Use them if it comes to it." Elias left the office with the weight of those words pressing on him. He had lived by self-reliance all his life, but the sheriff was right. Men could not always fight alone. That night, as he mended a fence post by lantern light, a shot cracked through the darkness. The bullet struck the ground a foot from his boots, spraying dirt. Elias dropped low, rifle swinging up in instinct. He caught the flash of a muzzle at the tree line and fired back. Another shot answered, splintering the fence beside him. The exchange was brief, no more than a handful of shots, then silence. When Elias finally rose, chest heaving, the night had swallowed his attackers. The valley seemed to hold its breath once more. Back inside, he sat at the table, the doll and toy horse staring from the mantel. His hands trembled as he reloaded his rifle, though his jaw was set firm. He muttered, "So it's men after all. Just as I reckoned." Sleep came in fits. Each creak of the shack sent his pulse racing. Each howl of the wind had him clutching the rifle tighter. By morning, the ground outside bore hoofprints leading away, proof the night had not been a dream. Elias stood over them, breath steady in the cold dawn, and felt both dread and resolve. The bandits had tested him once, and he had answered. But he knew well enough that shadows did not withdraw after a single exchange. They gathered, waiting for the right moment to strike again. The land's silence seemed to whisper it plain. Violence was coming, and the shack would not be spared. The day after the gunfire, Elias rode back into town, the memory of those voices gnawing at him. He went straight to Sheriff Hensley's office, boots crunching on the wooden floor. Walt was there, cleaning his revolver, and looked up with sharp eyes. "They came again," Elias said flatly. "Shots in the dark. Near had me pinned against my own fence." Walt's jaw set hard. "Then it's clear they're not just riding through. They're circling for a reason." Elias leaned against the wall, arms folded. "You hinted before about the Averys. Threats, maybe bandits. I need the whole of it, Sheriff. What really happened?" Walt sighed, setting the revolver aside. "Truth is, most folks buried the memory, but I was a deputy back then, green as spring grass. I recall Thomas Avery coming to town one night, jaw tight, eyes mean. Said some men rode up his place demanding he sell the land cheap. He told 'em no. Told me they looked like the kind who don't ask twice. I offered to post a deputy with him, but he waved it off. Said he could handle it. And then his family vanished," Elias said, voice low. The sheriff nodded. "Winter came quick that year. Snow buried half the tracks before we could follow. We searched 3 days. Found nothing but scraps in the cellar, like they'd left in a hurry. My gut told me those men came back, but without proof." He spread his hands helplessly. Elias stared at the floorboards. "So the land's been marked since. Folks whisper curses, but it's just men and greed." "Likely," Walt agreed, "but men and greed can be curse enough." Later that afternoon, Elias walked to the inn. Sarah Jennings looked up from polishing glasses when he entered. "You've got the look of a man dragging a heavy load," she said. He sat, nodding for coffee. "Sheriff told me what he remembers. Said Thomas Avery refused to sell. Bandits pressed him, then he and his family disappeared." Sarah's face tightened. "I always feared as much. Folks like to dress it up with ghost tales, but evil's often plainer. Sometimes it wears boots and spurs." Elias studied her. "You knew Margaret, didn't you?" Sarah's eyes softened. "She came by often. Bought flour, cloth, little things for the children. Sweet woman, strong too. She had a way of making you feel welcome even when you were the stranger." Sarah paused, then added with a trembling voice, "That's why it cut so deep. One day she was here, talking about a harvest supper, and the next, gone, like the ground swallowed her whole." Elias let the silence stretch, then said, "If men did this, then it ain't just a mystery. It's a wrong left to rot. I don't stomach living on ground soaked in someone else's fight without knowing the end of it." Sarah leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Be careful. Men who do such things don't take kindly to truth rising again. And if those drifters are tied to it, you're stirring a nest of hornets." Elias gave a grim smile. "I've been stung before. But I'll not build my life on lies." When he returned to the shack that evening, the valley seemed to hum with memory. He looked at the toy horse and the doll on the mantel, their small eyes reflecting the firelight. They were no longer just curiosities, they were silent witnesses. He sat at the table, journal open, and wrote with steady hand. The Averys were threatened. Bandits wanted this land. Family gone since, strangers circling again. The past is not finished here. As he laid down the pencil, the fire popped, and he felt the truth settling deeper. This land carried not just survival, but a reckoning. And whether he wished it or not, Elias McGraw was standing in the center of it. The bandits did not strike right away. Days passed in tense silence, as though the valley itself waited for the next move. Elias worked as usual, hauling wood, checking traps, patching the shack against spring rains. But one morning, when he opened the storeroom, his stomach dropped. The sacks of flour were split open, beans scattered, smoked venison gone. His winter's stores had been stripped clean, the door latch pried with a blade. The mule stamped nervously outside, as though it had sensed intruders during the night. Elias crouched by the broken latch, jaw tight. "So that's how you play it," he muttered. He rose, fists clenched, eyes scanning the tree line. Tracks pressed into the mud, boot prints, 2 or 3 sets leading north. They'd taken his food and left him a choice: chase them into the hills or start over from near nothing. That evening, he rode into town, weary but resolved. Sarah Jennings saw his face the moment he entered the inn. "They came again, didn't they?" she asked quietly, setting aside the rag in her hand. "They didn't fire shots this time," Elias answered, lowering himself at a table. "Took my stores. Near all of it, left me with scraps." Sarah frowned, her brow creasing. "You can't let them bleed you dry, Elias. That's how men like that work. They push, little by little, until you're too tired to stand." Elias gave a grim smile. "Ain't in me to lay down, but I'd be a fool to ride alone into their camp." She leaned closer, voice dropping. "Then don't. You've stood half your life alone, but you don't have to now. Walt trusts you more than most will admit, and there are men in this town who don't take kindly to thieves. Ask for help, Elias. There's no shame in it." Her words settled heavy. Pride warred with practicality. He had survived grizzlies, blizzards, and hunger by his own hand. But this was not the wilderness. These were men with malice, and Sarah was right. Men were harder to face alone. When he left the inn, he found Sheriff Hensley waiting near the hitching post. Walt studied him for a long moment before speaking. "Heard you were looking light on supplies." Elias met his gaze. "Bandits came last night, took near everything." The sheriff spat into the dust. "Damn vultures." "You aim to track 'em?" "I thought on it," Elias admitted. "But Sarah's right. Alone, it's suicide." Walt nodded. "Good. Shows sense. We'll figure something together. I'll ride out, bring 2 men I trust. You'll get your food back, or at least make sure they don't come sniffing again." For the first time, Elias felt a crack in the wall he had built around himself. Help was not weakness, but a bond. He gave a short nod. "Then I'll stand with you. Shack's mine, and I'll not let wolves in boots drive me off." That night, back at the shack, Elias sat by the fire, rifle across his knees. The toy horse and doll still watched from the mantel, silent witnesses to his trials. He studied them a long while, then spoke aloud. "You were chased once. Maybe no one stood with you. But I've got folk standing with me now." The words surprised him with their weight. The loneliness that had haunted him through winter eased just slightly, replaced by the faint warmth of belonging. Still, as the wind rattled the shutters and the night pressed heavy against the walls, Elias knew the real test lay ahead. The bandits had taken his food, but what they truly wanted was his land, and they would not stop until they forced him to yield or fought to take it. The night came heavy with silence, the kind that warned Elias more than any howl of wolves. He sat at his table, rifle cleaned, pistol laid ready, lantern turned low. Sheriff Hensley's promise of help had steadied him, but the bandits did not wait for daylight. The first sign was the mule's frantic bray. Elias moved to the window and saw shadows shifting at the tree line. Voices followed, rough and sharp. "Tonight we finish it," one growled. Another answered, "Take him alive if you can, but burn the shack if you must." Elias's jaw tightened. He swung the rifle up and fired through the dark. A cry split the night, followed by gunfire that peppered the shack's walls. Wood splintered, glass shattered, and smoke filled the air with the smell of gunpowder. He rolled low, reloading quick, every motion sharpened by years of mountain survival. A voice outside shouted, "You can't hold out, old man!" "Land don't belong to you," Elias barked back. "It's mine now, and you'll bleed before you take it." Bullets thudded against the door. He braced it with a beam, heart hammering. Sweat ran down his temples despite the cold. The shack groaned under the assault, but Elias fought like the storm itself. Then hoofbeats thundered from the ridge. Sheriff Hensley's voice rang out. "Hold your fire, McGraw, it's us." Shots cracked from a new angle as Walt and 2 deputies charged in, guns blazing. The fight turned fierce. Bandits ducked for cover, firing back, curses flying with each shot. Elias kicked the door open, rifle in hand, and joined the fray. The valley roared with gunfire, sparks flashing in the night. One outlaw rushed close, revolver raised. Elias met him head-on, slamming the rifle's butt across the man's jaw. The outlaw fell, teeth scattering in the dirt. Another lunged from the side, knife glinting. Elias caught his arm, the blade slicing across his sleeve, and they grappled in the mud, breath hot and ragged. The man hissed, "This land ain't worth dying for." Elias growled back, "It's worth living for." With a heave, he threw the bandit off, drew his pistol, and fired. The man went still. Gunfire raged until the outlaws broke, scattering into the trees. Sheriff Hensley shouted, "Don't let 'em ride." His deputies gave chase, driving the men into the night. Elias staggered against the shack, chest heaving, ears ringing. Smoke clung to his clothes, his knuckles raw and bleeding. Sheriff Hensley rode back, reining in hard. "You standin'?" Walt asked. Elias nodded, though his legs trembled. "Still standin'. Shack, too." The sheriff's eyes swept the bullet-pocked walls. "You fought like 10 men, McGraw. They'll think twice before circling again." Elias glanced toward the mantel through the open door, where the toy horse and doll still rested in the flickering firelight. A strange calm settled over him. The shack had nearly burned, but it had held. He had nearly fallen, but he had stood. Walt clapped his shoulder. "You're part of this valley now, whether the town admits it or not. A man who fights for his home earns his place." Elias said nothing, but inside something shifted. For years he had been a wanderer, belonging nowhere. Tonight, through blood and fire, he had claimed not just a shack, but a stake in the valley's future. The night grew still again, the echoes of gunfire fading into memory. Elias sheathed his pistol, looked to the horizon, and whispered, "It's mine. At last it's mine." The shack creaked in the wind, battered but unbroken, standing with him against the dark. The valley was quiet after the fight, but quiet did not mean peace. Elias patched bullet holes in the shack, cleaned his rifle, and mended his bruises. Yet the shadows of what Sheriff Hensley had told him gnawed deeper than the wounds on his flesh. The Averys had stood their ground once, and their story had been swallowed by silence. Elias felt a fire inside. He would not let their fate remain forgotten. Days later, he rode into town, seeking answers from the oldest voices still alive. He found them on the porch of the livery, where 2 gray-haired ranchers sat whittling wood and spitting tobacco. Elias greeted them plain and asked about the Avery family. The older of the two, a man named Henry Cole, narrowed his eyes. "You stirring that story again. Folks buried it for a reason." "Maybe they buried it," Elias said, "but the truth don't rot." Cole exchanged a look with his companion, then sighed. "I was there the winter they vanished. Men rode up from the south, outlaws by the look. They leaned hard on Thomas Avery, told him to sell the land cheap. He refused, said he'd die before letting wolves steal his ground. A week later, him and his kin were gone." The second man, Ezra Pike, added in a gravelly voice, "Some say the bandits took 'em, forced 'em to flee. Others whisper they were cut down out in the woods, buried where no one would find 'em. But we all knew. This valley held men who didn't care for law, only for taking. Sheriff tried, but he was one against many. After a while, folks stopped asking questions." Elias's jaw tightened. "And left the shack to rot, so their memory rotted with it." "That's the way of the frontier, McGraw," Cole said softly. "Land remembers longer than men do." Elias left them with a heavy heart, the truth burning in his chest. The Averys had not been cursed by the land. They had been crushed by greed and silence. He thought of the doll and the toy horse, relics of children whose laughter once filled the walls he now called home. That night, as he set them back on the mantel, he whispered, "You ain't forgotten." "Not while I'm here." The town's view of Elias began to shift. Word spread of the stand he'd taken against the bandits, of how Sheriff Hensley and his men had fought beside him. Sarah Jennings welcomed him with a smile warmer than before, saying, "You've proven what kind of man you are, Elias. Folks see it now." They may never say it plain, but they know. Even those who once whispered curses now greeted him with nods, some even stopping to trade without hesitation. The fear that had clung to his name began to thin, replaced by something steadier, respect. Elias felt the change inside himself as well. For years he had been a drifter, a ghost in the mountains. But by standing his ground, by uncovering the truth of those who had vanished, he had found more than survival. He had found purpose. The shack was no longer just a place to weather storms. It was a legacy, a promise that the past would not be erased. One evening, Sheriff Hensley rode out to the shack, dismounting slow. He looked over the patched walls and the smoke curling from the chimney. "You've done something here, McGraw," he said. "Not just holding land. You gave voice to those who lost theirs. That's worth more than any claimed deed." Elias met his gaze, steady and sure. "I didn't plan on carrying their story, but once you know the truth, you can't let it die." The sheriff tipped his hat. "Then you've earned your place here. Don't let anyone tell you different." As the sun set behind the ridges, Elias stood outside the shack. The valley spread before him. The past had scarred this land, but it had not broken it, and it would not break him. Spring thawed the valley into life again. Snowmelt swelled the creeks, green shoots broke through the soil, and the air smelled of pine and fresh rain. For the first time since he had set foot on the property, Elias stood outside the shack without feeling the weight of suspicion pressing on him. The land was still wild, still dangerous, but it no longer felt like it was waiting to cast him out. The shack itself bore scars from winter and from battle, patched holes in the walls, a door reinforced with new beams, a fence rebuilt stronger than before. Elias had turned ruin into shelter, and in doing so had built more than a home. He had built belonging. One morning, Sarah rode out with a basket of bread and fresh butter. She dismounted with a smile. "Town's different now, Elias. Folks speak your name with respect. Even Hank, the one who called you cursed, said you fought like a man worth knowing." Elias chuckled low. "That's near a compliment coming from Hank." Sarah's smile softened. "You did more than fight, Elias. You gave people here a reason to remember the Averys, not as a ghost story, but as folks who lived and mattered." He looked toward the mantel inside, where the toy horse and doll still rested. "I reckon they've been waiting a long time for that." Later that week, Sheriff Hensley rode out once more. He walked the clearing with Elias, studying the ridges. "Bandits won't bother you now," he said. "We ran the last of them south, and word'll spread that this valley ain't theirs to pick at anymore. You held your ground, McGraw. That counts for something." Elias nodded. "I didn't do it alone. You and your men stood with me, Sarah too. Guess a man can fight the wild by himself, but not men with guns." Walt clapped him on the shoulder. "That's the truth. You've earned your place here. Town knows it, whether they say it plain or not." As the sheriff rode away, Elias stood long in the clearing, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face. For decades he had drifted rootless as wind through the mountains. Now for the first time he felt tethered, not trapped but grounded. He had faced storms, wolves, loneliness, and men bent on driving him out, and still he remained. That night, sitting by the fire, Elias opened his journal. His handwriting was rough, uneven in the dim light, but steady. "The land is mine now. The Averys are not forgotten. A man cannot erase the past, but he can honor it by standing where others fell. I came here for shelter, found more than I reckoned." He closed the book, set it aside, and let his eyes rest once more on the relics of the children who had lived before him. They were not silent burdens anymore. They were reminders of loss, yes, but also of endurance. Looking into the fire, Elias spoke aloud, voice low but firm. "This shack ain't cursed, it's a home, and as long as I draw breath, it'll stay that way." The flames crackled, the valley quiet around him. For the first time in years, Elias felt peace. Not the hollow peace of solitude, but the steady kind that came from knowing a man had faced trial and come out stronger. His journey had begun with whispers of curses and a land folks feared to touch. It ended with something greater, a place where he belonged, and a legacy that would not be erased. Before closing this chapter, I'll ask you one last time. If you've walked through this story with Elias McGraw, facing storms, shadows, and the weight of the past, make sure you subscribe. There are more journeys to share, more lives carved into the wild corners of history. And don't stop here. Click on the next story waiting for you. It's on the screen now. The frontier holds countless tales, and this was only one of them.